So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Prof. Chris,
Waalaikumsalam.
good. Okay. Okay. Thanks a lot for coming. Thank you for all of you, hundreds of participants across the world who join us today. It is my honor to welcome all of you and thank you for joining us today for ESL online summer course entitled Reducing Carbon Footprint from Individual to Global Action. My name is Pini. I'm a lecturer in the Resource and Environmental Economics or ESL Department, Faculty of Economics and Management, IPB University. Today, we have two fantastic speakers who will teach us about two topics. The first lecturer is Professor Christopher Bennett. Prof. Chris is an adjunct professor from British Columbia University, Canada. Thank you so much, Prof. Chris, for your time. And also, good evening. Prof. Chris will talk about landscape-based approaches to reducing carbon footprints. Before I hand over this presentation to Prof. Chris, I'd like to introduce to all of you about our first speaker. Prof. Chris, his main fields of interest and publication are in the project and policy impact evaluation, agroforestry, forestry, natural resource governance, and landscape life space analysis. Prof. Chris, the time and place are yours.
Thank you very much, Penny, and thank you to all of you who are here. First of all, can you hear me clearly?
It's wonderful.
Okay, great. I'm speaking from Canada, although usually I live and work in Indonesia, and so I'm rather heavily dressed. And before I start, I'd like to say it's a great pleasure to be invited by IPB ESL to lecture to all of you, not just in Indonesia, but across several other countries. It's a great pleasure and a great honor. I propose to take about half an hour or so, maybe a little bit longer with my presentation, and then focus on your questions, because what matters most of all to all of us lecturers is your interest, your questions, your challenges as well. I have worked for the last 30 years in natural resource governance and management, and I like to think of myself as a provocateur, but not a political provocateur, a provocateur pikiran, a provocateur of thinking. And I hope to share with you my experience, my research on the subject that is our topic for discussion today, and that is landscape-based approaches as a means of addressing climate change challenges. And I will now try to upload my presentation. If this fails, Dr. Pinney, I'll ask you to help me, but give me just a moment, if you would. I always wonder whether this will work, and it does. It seems like it has worked. Okay, good. All right. Please let me know if you cannot see. I'm assuming you can. And
Yeah, sure.
I think I need to put the full screen on. Right. Okay, very good. Fantastic. So then again, to repeat to you all, the topic of this is landscape-based approaches to reducing carbon footprints. And the focus of my work, the focus of the idea that I want to convey and share with you is indeed based in Indonesia. And in an earlier version of this, I forgot to put a map of Indonesia. So basically, I'm going to be talking to you about various research and experiences across Indonesia over the last 30 years in the issue of landscape-based approaches. And we will be looking at examples of field research, which I hope to share with you, that have informed this approach to reducing carbon emissions. The research has taken place, as you can see where my cursor is here, in the central part of Java. It has also taken place in Sumatra and in Papua as well. And finally, in the peat swamps of central Kalimantan here. So you might like to flip back to this if you want to know exactly where it is that we are focusing our attention during this lecture. First of all, some of you may be wondering what landscapes are all about. There is some confusion about landscapes. Landscapes are often understood to mean the landscape in your back garden. But the landscape approach and landscape-based approaches that I will be sharing with you is how we approach geographical areas, managing those areas, governing those areas to ensure that we reduce carbon emissions and wherever possible absorb carbon emissions. And landscape in this sense, in this scientific sense, is a term that is relatively new in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And it was only in the middle of the 1990s that really the idea of being landscape wise, that means being concerned to understand the nature and the complexity of land use management and how this affects carbon emissions. As I'm sure many of you will realize, land use accounts for over 20% of carbon emissions in the world today. What is a landscape-based approach? Well, I love language. I speak Indonesian, but I will speak English, of course, for this. But landscape comes from the German and Dutch word Landschap, which means land shaping. In other words, it means how we influence and change the nature of a geographical area by our exploitation, by our resource use, and so on and so forth. It is really essentially a combination of interconnected ecological, social, and administrative considerations, which together craft and define the landscape. And we tend to divide landscape-based approaches into an understanding of, in a given area, it might be a watershed, a river basin, it might be the highlands, it can be whatever you want it to be in development, but you must be clear about the geographical area to which you are applying this methodology. And it has three components. The first one is an understanding of the biophysical and social characteristics of the area. To keep things simple, imagine that we're in a river basin here and that is our landscape. Like I say, it doesn't have to be a river basin. It could be peat swamps along the coast. But in this case, imagine a river network with its tributaries and villages and towns, and that is our focus. And the first thing we need to do is to understand what the biophysical and what the social characteristics are. And the second thing we need to do is to understand what the environmental functions are. Each has a function. It might be a source of emissions, or it might be a sink of emissions. It might be capturing emissions. In the case of a forest, it's capturing emissions, for example. If it is an area very vulnerable to fire, then of course it's a source of emissions. And then the third point, which is of fundamental importance, is even if we scientifically understand the functions, does society, do ordinary people, politicians, ministries, do they value these functions? It is important to realize that the landscape and a landscape-based approach is indeed an approach rather than a particular area. It can be applied to whatever area you like. It can be applied to a small island. In this particular case, we'll be thinking a lot about river basins, but it can be, as long as you're clear about what your geographical area is, landscape-based means the process, the approach. And the fundamental importance for ensuring that we have successful management, sustainable management of a given geographical area using a landscape-based approach is coordination. Coordination, coordination, coordination. Coordination horizontally across the landscape, but also vertically. The relationship between the river basin, for example, and national and regional policies as well. And this we will see is a particular challenge as we seek to understand better what we mean by landscape approaches and why they are so important. At a very simple level, this is a village. This is a village in the northern part of the island of Sumatra, where the landscape is a small river basin and is traditionally very well managed. I don't need to tell you, I'm sure, that these are rice fields here, which are irrigated by streams that come down from the forest here. But all the forest you can see here, everything here, not in the far distance, but everything here has been is being cultivated and planted by local communities. And there is a keen understanding in this particular village, it's the village of Alu Selassie, in a district called Aceh Barat Daya, and we're going to look at this a little bit later, in Aceh. And there's a keen understanding about the relationship between these forests which have been planted by the local community, and these are nutmeg forests, durian forests, and clove forests, so they have value in of themselves for trading their produce, but they also protect the water resources that go into the rice fields. Some of the farmers here will also be rice farmers, not always, but often that will be the case. But in this particular setting, landscape-based approaches are something that have been going on for hundreds of years and don't need scientists, people like me or anybody else, to tell them how to manage their landscapes. They're doing very well. But of course, at a larger scale, as we modernize agriculture and we have larger scale agriculture, then it becomes more challenging. This is a schematic produced by the World Bank, which rather nicely shows, again, a river basin, but the fact that within the river basin, we have different sectors, different ministries. We have the Ministry of Spatial Planning, which decides what part of the land should be used for what. We have the Ministry of the Environment and Forestry, which decides what should be planted in these areas. We have in the lowlands here peatlands, and so the Peatland Restoration Agency, and these are all government agencies, will decide how we should plan and implement restoration of the peatlands. We have the Water Management Agency of Public Works, which is concerned with making sure that water reaches the villages, water reaches the towns, water does not flood during the rainy season, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, we have the Ministry of Agriculture. Unfortunately, it is much more difficult for these ministries to truly cooperate and collaborate together. Although their mandate says they should, it is a particular challenge because they are different ministries. Another issue here, of course, is when you start to manage at a large scale a landscape, large estates, for example, then of course you need to concern yourself with finance, which is something else that needs to be considered when thinking about sustainable landscape management. So basically, what are the features of what I will call integrated landscape management, whereby we manage the land in such a way that is sustainable, it's productive, it's economically productive, it is resulting in benefits to a broad swath of society, and it is being done in a sustainable way and also in a way that does not result in carbon emissions. In order for this to be the case, there are really 5 dimensions. We need to have a platform, a multi-stakeholder platform, whereby all the different stakeholders will be able to talk to each other. We need to have a shared vision, if you will, another C, a shared commitment, even though there may be multiple objectives, so that ultimately we will want to cooperate together between the government departments, between the communities, and between the private sector. And we need to do something which is often not given sufficient emphasis. We need to work together participatorily, collaboratively, to decide what part of the landscape should be used for conservation, what should be used for production, what part should be used for rural development, what for urban, and how do you maintain connections between the two? And that is what we mean spatial planning. That's an important dimension to a landscape-based approach. Site-level suitable practices and interventions. We must escape, of course, from theory. And later on in my presentation, I'm going to give you some very, very practical examples. Right now, forgive me if I bore you with a bit of theory and a bit of principle, but I think that it's important that we start with a theory of change, that we start with these structural framework dimensions. But we do need to think about what we will be doing at the ground level. We need to be thinking about how we will be accounting, obviously, for our carbon emissions. We will need to be also looking at trade-offs between conservation and production. We will need to be using instruments that truly mean that there is participation between the different stakeholders, communities, the corporate sector, the private sector, and governments as well. And therefore, as far as possible, we want what I refer to here as FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent. Everybody agrees before the investment that they would like to do this. And if they don't want to do a particular investment, some kind of plantation, be it forestry or agriculture or fisheries, they have the right to refuse. And then the tool, one of the tools that we use is a landscape lifescape analysis, whereby we catalog and chronicle the characteristics, social, physical, as well as economic, biophysical. We look at these characteristics together in a critical way, and then we look at how we think their functions are, and also then finally we try to figure out whether society is valuing them before we begin any kind of landscape-based approach, any kind of intervention. And then finally, of course, legal legitimacy. It's no good operating without a legal policy framework. And these 5 elements come together time and time again in a successful landscape-based approach. When we fail to achieve landscape-based approaches, as we have done in the past, all over the world, including my country, you can probably tell from my accent, although I am a professor at the University of British Columbia, I am in fact British. I come from England. And we made a pretty poor mess of our landscapes during the Industrial Revolution. Some would say the trade-off was worth it, but nonetheless, one must admit that we did that. But if you do not have a landscape-based approach, if you do not learn the lessons from history, then the result will tend to be short-term and extractive land use management, resulting in degradation and deforestation, increasing greenhouse gas emissions because of forest fires, peatland fires, and so on and so forth, of which I'm sure you're all familiar. And I don't need to go over the downside of this. I'm going to focus in my talk with you about what we do to make sure that we avoid these kind of negative effects. So what are the key enabling conditions for landscape-based approaches? Now, oftentimes, many investment projects, even though they're well-intended, by governments, by the private sector, tend to rush too quickly to the management of the land without thinking about how it should be zoned. And everybody should participate in the zonation. What should be conserved? What should be protected? What can be used for production? And what is the relationship between them? We also need to be very, very clear about the difference between land status and function. What do I mean by that? Land status is the formal administrative classification of the land. In other words, it's a state forest area or it's private land, for example. But what we're most concerned with, as landscape approaches teach us, is we're really most concerned with function. What is the actual function? Yeah, I'm not going to say that the legal status is not important, because otherwise, of course, there will be mismanagement with no legal consequences. But we need to reconcile status and function, administrative classification and actual environmental function. And we need to do both of these, A and B, in an inclusive participatory way, not just because of the issue of rights, the rights of local communities, traditional communities to have a say, but because they have local knowledge, indigenous knowledge. No, they're not scientists, it's true, but they do bring knowledge. That is the subject of another lecture that I would have loved to have given you, but I just had to focus on this one. And that is the amazing amount of knowledge which is built up over hundreds of years, which is useful to landscape-based approaches. And that's why participatory land use zonation, that's why participatory management is important. Not just because of the rights of local communities, but because of their knowledge. The knowledge they have built up through trial and error over how to manage fires, how to conserve water, how to conserve soils, how to organize themselves in that direction. The other thing that we need to think about is that at the end of the day, even if we do zone conservation areas and we do zone production areas, we need to make sure that the scale is small enough. If the scale is too big, nobody knows where the division line is between, for example, a conservation area and a production area. About 1 to 5,000 scale will enable everybody to have a map in their hands whereby the thickness of a line the thickness of a line will be a few meters. And so you'll be able to translate the map into what you're looking there. Now, of course, we need large-scale maps as well. Indonesia, for example, does spatial planning at 1 to 150,000 at the provincial level and 1 to 50,000 at the district level. But that really is not enough for good landscape-based approaches. We need to come down to 1 to 5,000. What practical approaches at the ground level are fundamental to ensuring a genuinely landscape-based approach? There are two. One is, well, I mean, they both have their challenges. One is spatial planning or zonation, which is at a small enough scale to make sense to everybody so people can understand the maps. The maps can easily be translated to the characteristics of the ground. Where is the river? Where is the road? Where is the hill? For example, where is the lake? We need to readily be able to take those maps and recognize where those places are on the maps at a scale which is small enough for everybody to appreciate. And we need accountable licensing. What do we mean by licensing? That means the permits and the licenses given to those who will manage the land, given to those by the state in state forest areas especially, but also in private land, that licensing process is truly accountable to all the stakeholders. The main steps of practical success so far. How have we succeeded so far? And here we're starting to move in my talk towards what has actually happened in Indonesia, and I hope will be of most interest to you as we move from the theoretical, as we move from the conceptual to the practical. Well, we've had a lot of success in Indonesia, and this is through participation between communities, the government of Indonesia and the private sector in participatory or inclusive zonation or land use planning, whereby we decide where should there be conservation, where should there be production. And we're going to look at some examples of those in a minute. We've also had not quite as much success, but nonetheless some very notable success in genuine collaborative management. So I want you conceptually to think about when in landscape approaches, we need to think about the where before we think about the what. But we do need to think about the what it is we're going to do there. And we do need, in both cases, when we're figuring out the where, the mapping, and when we're figuring out the what, we need to be inclusive. Inclusive because the different sectors and ministries each bring great value and commitment to their particular sectors. And of course, local communities have this tremendous reservoir of human knowledge and social capital, which is can be so tremendously important in developing countries like Indonesia. What additional government support is needed? And government support is needed. And don't get me wrong, this is not all about communities being left to their own devices or communities in the private sector, but there must be a trifecta, if you will, a three-part collaboration. And that is between the government, between the local community stakeholders, and the private stakeholders. And when it comes to government involvement, we need to talk about the what are the regulatory and procedural processes that link everything together. In Indonesian, we use the term the benang merah, or the red thread, which is really the regulatory linkage between these different stakeholders. There are various policies in Indonesia nowadays which are of particular interest. I don't want to dwell too much on them because they will not be of so much importance perhaps to some of our international audience, but Indonesia has come up with some very, very exciting innovative policies in recent years, such as the Government Policy 45 of 2017, on insisting that communities participate in regional governance. The BRG, the Peatland Restoration Agency, has insisted that in all the peatlands and all the many millions of hectares of peatlands of Indonesia, whenever there is any kind of development or restoration in those peatlands, which, by the way, during the dry season become very vulnerable to fire and can account for up to 80% of Indonesia's smoke, haze, and carbon emissions. But nonetheless, that the delineation, the zonation of those areas in the peatlands, as well as what is done in them, should follow FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent. We have more and more detailed guidelines for participatory zonation. In the early years, when I began this work 30 years ago, many parts of the Indonesian forestry estate, which accounts for 60% or more of Indonesia's land base, it's a huge area, did not allow for participatory zonation. That means working together with communities to decide what part of the forest should be for production, what should be for conservation. Now we have those policies in place. I didn't name the policy here, but the landmark policy here was in 2015, and it was PP 108. And also exciting nowadays is the fact that the Spatial Planning and Agrarian Reform Ministry is now formulating policies for spatial planning at the village level, not just at the provincial and the district level, but at the village level, at clusters of villages. And that's really very exciting. There's a really serious move. Some of you may question this because of very recent policy changes, but I would argue that the government of Indonesia is increasingly interested in involving local communities in planning and implementation of landscape management. And then within the Ministry of Forestry, one of the most exciting of all, within the Conservation Directorate General, is a new paradigm, a 10-point paradigm, which is spearheaded by Director General Wiratno, which is all about participation and cooperation and collaboration with local communities, all of which promises to tap into the indigenous technical knowledge of those local communities. So this is not just about rights, as I said before, it's also about the knowledge of local communities to achieve landscape-based approaches. Let's take an even closer look at landscape management, where it's going on, the challenges, the achievements, and the opportunities. As I mentioned, one of the problems is that the maps of land use status do not always match function. This is a historical problem which goes back 40 years when it was very difficult to do mapping. We didn't have satellite information, and there was a mismatch often between the formal classification of the land and what its actual function was. But fortunately, there has been since then a correction of this, which has been led by the government of Indonesia to make up for this mismatch. The mismatch has meant that large-scale maps misalign with topographical features. In other words, the boundary between a conservation area doesn't neatly follow the ridge of a hill or a river or a road for that matter, but arbitrarily cuts across an area. That is being corrected, but it's very difficult to manage areas that have boundaries that do not follow topographical features. The problem was originally top-down delineation or mapping, but that is changing with greater involvement of local communities in the improvements of the maps. There have been challenges to changes in land use status as well, arguments over whether the classification of conservation should be kept at conservation or it should be moved to production if it has been degraded for a long time, or even taken out of the public domain and given into private sector management. There are various intersectoral constraints because ministries find it difficult to collaborate, although they do formally. Their mandates say they must, but they do find it sometimes quite difficult to do that at the ground level. At the end of the day, we need complementarity. This is not about pointing the finger at somebody. I'm a provocateur piquirani here. I'm not a provocateur politica. It's about making sure that we have complementarity between the legal framework, the policies, the regulations, the social norms, and of course, the technical legitimacies as well. In other words, what modern science tells us will help us to improve the productivity of the land. Participatory zonation. We're going to have a look at that shortly. And this is an example of how the government has now invited communities to provide input to the geographical information system mappers to improve the maps. And this helps us with landscape-based approaches. It helps us to match the classification of the map with the function, so that ultimately our functions and our societal values come together more neatly. So let's take a look here at the case of an area on the west coast of Sumatra in the province of Aceh, where there are a lot of agroforests. Agroforests that largely are cultivated by smallholders who grow nutmegs, they grow cloves, and also durian, a delicacy, I think, but not everybody, certainly not every international student of you will like durian, but I love durian. But let me not digress. Basically, in order that we have participatory land use zonation that really has a chance of succeeding. It's no good producing a beautiful map if it's not respected. But each step of producing a better map depends upon the application of three core principles of good governance. Transparency, and that is everybody being clear about what the official maps are, so people can look at the official maps and they can compare the maps with the reality in their village. Participation, whereby the government and the local community come together, and accountability, responsibility for the outcomes of any kind of changes in the land use zonation. We're going to look here. Here we are. Let me just see if I can get this all up here. So this is a river basin. And there we are. So basically the river basin, I'm pointing a finger at the finger is no good. I've got to use the cursor. So basically here is the coast. The black here is water. This is the coastal area. And the district capital is here of the district of Aceh Barat Daya. And here we are in the northwestern part of Sumatra, the northwestern part of Sumatra in the province of Aceh. And we're right here. So this is the capital, and this is a river basin. This is the watershed. In other words, this is the line across which all water will flow this way into the river Suso, as it's called. I'm sorry we don't seem to be able to see it more clearly. no, I can't put it up, but the Suso River flows here this way. So this here is the capital. This is private farmland, classified as private farmland. And then this also is private farmland, but this here is a production forest. We're moving upstream now, upstream. And then this is conservation. This is a national park, the National Park of Gunung Loisa, the National Park of Gunung Loisa. And basically the idea here that the government welcomed was to ask the community to help to improve the land use classification. Sorry, there is the watershed. I'm sorry. Here is the watershed here. Here is the actual watershed in blue, outside of land use classifications. And the river Suso flows through here. So basically, time is moving along. So I want to go back to a picture I showed you earlier. In private land, in that river basin, very sustainable, very sustainable. You have secure agroforests and rice fields. And the relationship between the two is very well understood by the community, as I mentioned earlier. But further upstream, when you go into the state forest land, this land actually is technically, legally under the control of the forestry agency, and nobody has private rights to it. And yet, all these trees you see here have been planted by local communities. They planted them before the map was created, which decided that this should be state forest areas. This is not rainforest. This is on the equator, close to the equator. It is not rainforest, but it's fulfilling the same function as this forest here. The lighting isn't quite the same, but here and here, what people are doing are intercropping durian trees, clove trees, and also nutmeg trees, which is very good for their livelihoods, but also protects water resources. And we are actually, where this is actually taking place is just about here. That's where these two pictures were taken. Just about here, in the village of Alu Selassie. So let's move on. And what happened was, and was very successful, was that there was a participatory process whereby specialists, mappers, government agencies, men and women together refined the map of the Ministry of Forestry. And the Ministry of Forestry and the Forest Management Unit accepted their recommendations to change the land use classification. And this was the result. This really happened. Historically, maybe sort of 30 years ago, this would have never happened. During a more autocratic time in Indonesia, when Indonesia was under President Suharto, it was very difficult to get government agencies to recognize the value and the knowledge of local communities. So at the end of the day, what we find here, which is very exciting, is that the land use status is changed in a way that's accepted by the Ministry of Forestry, accepted by their forest management unit. You might say, but why would they do this? Because aren't they losing the land? No, the land is still remains as state forest area. But the people are asking that where here you see this this mauve should be within the state forest areas is where the nutmegs and the cloves and the durian are grown is that they should be allowed to continue to harvest them and not be evicted from those areas. And they also further classify the land in the private area. This is private here. Everything green here and dark green is either protection forest or conservation area. But what's really interesting here is that the demands of the village, the request of the village to the government of Indonesia is quite modest. Look over here. Look over here. This is all national park. The villagers don't want to touch, they're not trying to touch any of this. This is all rainforest. They're only asking for the small buffer zone area to be recognized as being under their management. And this surprised the forestry agents when they saw how little of the state forest area the community wanted to gain access to, and they willingly agreed. And now what this means is that the community feels secure and they feel that they won't be evicted from these areas, and they agreed to prevent illegal loggers from going in to illegally log in the conservation area. Very much a win-win situation that was brought about in this landscape because of the government accepting that participation is important. This was just another village, same kind of thing. We must move on because I want you to have time to ask me questions. I want us to move on now to, earlier we were looking at the where, how in a landscape-based approach we get our maps right. If the maps aren't right, how do we know where we should be? So we've already looked at that, and the way to do that is to involve people, local people with government experts at a small scale, 1 to 5,000, so we can really refine where should be for production, where should be for conservation, and where communities have the rights to go. And this on a small scale has succeeded already in Indonesia. Next, what to do once the where, once the spatial side is resolved, if you have a good landscape-based approach. Well, of course, then there's the issue of what you do in a particular area. And now we're going to shift across from Sumatra on the western part of Indonesia to Borneo or Kalimantan in the central part of Indonesia, to the peatlands, which historically have been the source of most of Indonesia's carbon emissions from peatland fires. And here we're going to look at the case of 5 villages in a district that collaborated with government, and government willingly collaborated with them to restore the peatlands so that they could be reforested after the fires. After the fires of 2015, which were so tremendously damaging. The fires of 2015 in Indonesia created so much haze, so much carbon emissions, that they equaled the total number of carbon emissions of 3 or 4 countries in many parts of the world. So much was the carbon emission from the peatlands. Now, what we want to do in the peatlands is to reforest them. But before you can reforest them, before you can convert them back to the forests that have been destroyed by fire, you have to stop draining them. You have to re-wet them so they stay wet during the dry season and therefore are not so vulnerable to burning. And to do that, you need to block the canals, the drainage canals, which have in the past made them so dry, the peatlands, and so vulnerable to fire. This is what a firescape, I talk about a landscape, this is a firescape. So this once was a tropical rainforest, no more. destroyed in 2015 by the fires. And these are the drainage canals. You might say, why do people drain the canals? They drain these peatlands. They drain them because they want to plant oil palm here. Oil palm is not well suited to peatlands. Peatlands are really very poor in nutrients and therefore have to be heavily fertilized. And as a result, not only do we lose the natural forest and its biological diversity, but there's runoff into the canals of the excess phosphate and nitrate, which will pollute the water systems. The way to restore these areas, and the communities accepted they needed to restore the areas because the fire was so damaged, is to block these canals. And together with the community, here is a map. No need to worry about the details really, but during a process of free, prior, and informed consent, the government said, we would like to invite you to block the canals which are inside your areas so that the fire will be less likely during the dry season. And so the villagers and the engineers worked together. It was really quite remarkable to see engineers, scientific, technological engineers, working with villagers. And to begin with, it's interesting, I was there at the time, and I remember that the engineers had a rather superior attitude to the villagers. We don't need to learn anything from the villagers, they said. We know how to engineer dams across canals. Well, not so. As a result of information from the villagers, they were able to pinpoint where was the best place, this is indigenous local knowledge, to block the canals. Not only that, and this was particularly exciting, they were able to influence the engineers so that the dams, these are partial dams which reduce the flow. They allow boats to pass, but they constrict the flow, and so they keep the peatland wet during the dry season. But the design of the dam was changed when the engineers discovered, by speaking with local people, that their design was not appropriate to the local circumstances. Had the engineers put in their design, which was a much narrower dam, these would have collapsed during the rainy season with the force of the water. But because they accepted advice from the local communities, therefore they changed the design of the dam. This was, everybody agreed to this. So here we have social legitimacy, legal legitimacy, and technical legitimacy, all coming together, as they must if we are going to have a landscape-based approach. Here is the dam, and here are tracks along which motorcycles can pass. When the water level gets very low during the dry season, they can still gain access to their gardens along these areas. Interestingly, this was so successful that the government committed its own budget. What was going on here was a development project. This was a project that I was working on with USAID, but after that, because it succeeded, the government of Central Kalimantan put 1.6 billion rupees into canal blocking in neighboring districts as well, because they were so excited by the success of the FPIC. In Indonesia, it's called Padiatapa, free, prior, and informed consent. This is not the end of the story. People might say, yeah, but what happens down the line? Well, the USAID project ended. It came to an end, as many projects do. And I went on to join another organization to work for them, the Global Green Growth Institute. And some 4 or 5 years later, I was fortunate enough to return to the same area to see if this land use, participatory land use, participatory blocking of the canals was still in place. And frankly, I was surprised, very pleasantly surprised, to find that the villagers, since working with local government, since being assisted to block the canals and keep the area wet during the dry season, had changed from becoming fire setters to firefighters. They became firefighters. And that's what they told me, but I didn't accept this at face value. I looked at landscape, I looked at satellite imagery. By the way, over here is what happens when the peatlands catch fire. You don't want to get in the way in this kind of, it's very hot, it's very dangerous. You can be asphyxiated by the haze. Basically, here we have a village. There were 2 villages here. One village, this village, participated in FPIC and blocked their canals and became firefighters. This village did not. And these are fire hotspots from 2019, a year ago. This village just caught fire. All the peatlands caught fire. This village almost not. You might say, well, what about here? Well, to be fair, there was a very strong wind, and the wind carried the embers from the burning fires in this village across to this village. But the villagers nonetheless stayed awake at night to fight these fires. And again, because of social, technical, and legal legitimacy, because of participation, a landscape-based approach had this kind of success, and we could prove that it was successful. Let's move across now all the way to Papua. I hope you don't mind me showing too many maps, but it's what I do. And basically, here we're on the eastern part of Indonesia, which borders Papua New Guinea. And this is one of the biggest national parks in the world. It's 2.5 million hectares, and it is the Lawrence National Park. And it was initially zoned, but it was zoned really from Jakarta. And as a result, from the capital of Indonesia. And as a result, the zonation didn't make any sense at all. Rather than go into the details, let me say that wherever you see a circle here is a village. And the authorities had decided wherever there's a village, we will give a kilometer either side of the settlement to the village for them to do what they like. But that's a circle, a pure circle. You can't manage a circle in a tropical rainforest. It's difficult enough to manage a circle in North America, let alone in a tropical rainforest. This didn't make any sense. As a result, long story, after 2 or 3 years, the Ministry of Forestry, together with local communities, with the assistance of this case of the USAID Lestari project, was able to rezone the national park such that it made much, much more sense, and set aside areas for villages. Sorry, I'm losing my cursor. Here we are. This didn't make sense, but this makes a lot more sense. We have for those of you in Indonesia, this will make sense. It won't for our international folks, but I call this Mi Bakso map. Mi is the meatballs, and these are spaghetti, which really was functionless. It just couldn't be used. Whereas now, what do we have here? In Papua, we have what I like to call batik Papua. I'm sure our foreign students know what batik is. So it a little bit more resembles batik, which is a traditional Indonesian textile anyway. And as a result, the boundaries here more closely align with topographical features. They're more recognizable to communities on the ground, and therefore they're more likely to honor the boundaries rather than these circles, which made no management sense whatever. My final point is the role of visualization. I've tried to visualize to you the science. It's not just enough to have the science by itself. We've got to visualize the science. You might say, why? Leave it to the scientists. Well, not at all. Because if you're going to have participatory approaches, if you're going to involve village communities, they are not scientists. And neither are the heads of the regents or the districts. Neither is the governor. Neither are the newspapers either. You've got to think of some way to translate the science into a visual representation that makes sense. Otherwise, the science will seem remote and therefore not very trustworthy and not very useful either. The value of visualizing the true functions of the landscape, the peatlands, the rainforest, the swamps, the rivers, and so on and so forth. We can put numbers to those in terms of their hydrological value, their economic value, but we must also visualize what this means to the stakeholders, what it means to the private sector investors, what it means to the villagers as well, but what it also means to those who are going to pass the benang merah, the red thread, the rules and regulations. So it really is important for landscape-based approaches to have a visualization dimension. That doesn't just mean pretty pictures, it means connecting the science to the visual. And it's not just to let people know what the science says, but it's also to invite people to understand and then give feedback to the scientists. So then the scientists can improve their science and their technology. As I showed you earlier, when they changed the design of the dam, when they were blocking the waterways in the peatlands. So this is important then for the decision makers and the policy makers, those who make the rules, for those who are responsible for oversight of the land governance stewards, as we call them, and then for the users themselves, which brings us back, by the way, to what we're trying to do here with this course, is to think about, is to try to move from individual to global actions. What I've been doing today with you is showing us how we connect corporate, government, and individuals at a national level. But when this works well, this has positive global implications, not because necessarily the individuals in the private sector or the government are concerned about global issues. Some are, to be sure. In fact, Indonesia has signed on to many global treaties that have an environmental aspect to them, such as climate change, emissions and pollution and so on and so forth. But because it is tremendously important, if we are going to think globally, as we've said for many, many years, we have to figure out how we act locally. And landscape-based approaches help us to act locally in the interests of all the stakeholders, but in a way that will have a positive spin-off, a positive side effect at the global level. And before I close, I just want to show you one of Indonesia's government instruments, which is Strategic Environmental Assessment, SEA. Now, all plans in Indonesia, be they economic development or spatial plans, must be accompanied by a strategic environmental assessment. And that strategic environmental assessment, this is showing you some work that I was doing a few years ago, is intended to be participatory, is intended to encourage the corporate sector, the government, as well as the private sector, to compare and contrast the ideal scenario with extractive degradation and deforestation. And what we found was that for people to do this, they needed to understand what it meant to them personally. Here is a hunter. If he's in a landscape that's working well, he will be able to hunt and have game. If the landscape is degraded, no game. Or if you like, in this case, a fisherman with fish and without fish. To translate this to the community level, and then ultimately to translate it to the landscape-wide level. So it ultimately matches and meets the jurisdiction, the larger district or provincial scale as well. This is very much a work in progress, but it's very much an important part of making landscape-based approaches work. And so I'm about to conclude here. What are the opportunities looking ahead for Indonesia? I think they're very prospective. Some of you may challenge me on that. I am fundamentally an optimist, which is why, despite my white beard, I'm still in Indonesia, and I love to work in Indonesia because I see change, and I see change for the better. I know there are a lot of concerns. What will happen after the COVID pandemic, what will happen after various recent policy changes, but provided there are multi-stakeholder approaches, provided there are landscape-based approaches, I have every confidence that there will be sustainable solutions. And that means focusing on the where, which is the participatory landscape zonation, delineation, making sure that we try to cluster villages, because it's very difficult to manage these issues if you're dealing with 75,000 villages. I realize this is not India, where you have 750,000 villages, but still 75,000 villages is a lot to deal with. So basically we need to cluster the villages, cluster them within sub-watersheds, subdas, and organizing them accordingly with local government and with the private sector. And above all, and to its credit, Indonesia has accepted this, we need to ensure that we have free, prior, and informed consent. We have participation in both the delineation, the mapping of the land, as well as how we're going to develop that land. And all of this is to be found in today's regulations. They're not always enforced as much as they might be, but what's encouraging is that they are on the books. They are on the books. And that's as far as I'd like to go, Dr. Pini, because I fear I may have taken too much time, because I want to give the students an opportunity to challenge me. And I do want you to challenge me. And you can call me Chris, okay? Don't call me professor or doctor. Challenge me. Be skeptical. Be doubt. Very important. Doubt. Dare to doubt me. Dare to doubt authority. I hope that's not too political a statement for some of our foreign nations, but dare to challenge what I have said to you. And I propose to you that in order to ensure that from the individual to the global level, we manage to contribute to climate change, we need to adopt landscape-based approaches in the way that I have tried to summarize for you. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Dr. Pini. I will gladly take any questions in the remaining time. How much more time do we have?
We still have like 35 minutes for discussion.
I spoke too long. My
Oh,
apologies
no,
to
it's
all of
okay.
you. No, I must
We are really
apologize.
enjoy it.
No,
Sure.
no, no. 45 minutes is enough. Is enough for an old man with a white beard. Okay, please.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Chris. It's difficult without saying you,
I know.
Professor Chris.
Okay,
Okay, your presentation is really wonderful, and the pictures and the visuals are amazing. And I think you really help us to understand about a closer look at the landscape management, the challenges, achievement, and opportunities. During your presentation, there are many questions from the participants. I will invite them one by one to deliver their question directly to you. So we can have an interactive session now.
great.
Okay, for the first opportunity, maybe I will invite Hanin Tri from Myanmar. Yeah, are you there, Hanin?
Yes,
Yeah, yeah, please.
yes. Firstly, thank you for your amazing presentation. Yes, may I ask a question? I want to know and how can we manage safety cultivation?
Okay, thank you for that question. Shifting cultivation, actually, or the technical term for it, swidden, or slash and burn, can actually be sustainable. I'm going to qualify that, provided the cycle of shifting cultivation doesn't get too short. As you know, Henin, shifting cultivation means that you open the land, you slash, you burn. After 2 or 3 years, you move on because the soil has been depleted. And then you wait several years. It depends on the condition of the soil. It might be 7 years, it might be 15 years. And then the local people will recognize that the soil is already fertile enough, and then it can be opened again. Now, that kind of shifting cultivation, the traditional kind, the traditional swidden, is sustainable. However, if because of population pressure, farmers don't, they go back to the area they have left fallow too soon, before the soil has enriched itself again through the nitrogenating, fixing bacteria, through the mycorrhiza, through the fungi, through the sequence of trees, through to, and so on and so forth. Then we have a problem. And there, of course, we want to try to, if that is the case, I mean, if you have population pressure, you have population pressure. There you want to try to encourage, obviously, a transition from shifting cultivation, because there's too much pressure on the land, to enrich it with, for example, tree crops. It might be fruit trees, it might be rubber trees, it might be rattan. I mean, it depends on the local soil and so on and so forth. And then ultimately, but here's the problem, Henin, is that oftentimes farmers will not do that. They will not plant trees and then leave them and then come back maybe 7 or 10 years to tap the rubber or whatever it is. They will not do that unless they have security of tenure. So if you want to persuade farmers to invest in planting trees and to have a sustainable sedentary mixed tree crop system, like the one I showed you in the picture, the durian, the nutmeg, and the cloves, that is sustainable. It's completely sustainable. But they will not do that if they do not have security of tenure, because they're afraid that they might be evicted. And that's why policies need to be supportive of this as well. If you say, oh, we'll force them to plant trees, you may force them to plant trees, but they will not look after those trees. They will not look after those trees because they're not sure that they will own them. They're not sure that somebody else might not take them. It's a very complex issue. It's a very good question. But again, landscape-based approaches can be a way to, you've got to look at every location according to its characteristics. You've got to look at tenurial issues. You've got to look at the value of what's being planted to make sure it makes sense to the local community. It's no good planting trees which have no use to the local community because they will not want to look after them and they won't enjoy the benefits either. And so basically you need to also think about whether you can have payment for environmental services. In other words, if, as we have found in Indonesia, local communities plant trees, ultimately downstream municipalities pay them to keep the trees in place. So that's what we call a payment for environmental services, yeah. But even they won't plant the trees unless they have security of tenure. So tenure becomes very important if you want to break the cycle, Henin, of shifting cultivation. You cannot do it. You cannot do it without tenurial relationships. Now you might say, does that mean that we need to sell the land or give the land to the people? Not necessarily. It could be that you could give to the people leasehold. In Indonesia, Indonesia's done that with social forestry, whereby the lease is for 35 years. 35 years. On the understanding that you can extend the lease if you manage the land well with trees. And so you don't, tenure doesn't necessarily mean private ownership. It can mean leasehold, but it must be secure. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but so that needs to be taken into account in a landscape approach, obviously, because we all the time want to think about how we're bringing together social legitimacy, social norms with legal legitimacy, as well as technically what makes sense. I hope that makes sense to you. I'm sorry. I'd love to. I've never been to Myanmar, so but I understand it a little bit, but not as much as I should do to speak with authority.
Yeah. Thank you, Prof. Chris. For
You're
the next
welcome.
opportunity, I will invite Lulu Khairani from Indonesia. Lulu, are you there?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you
Yes,
for the
please, Lulu. Yeah.
opportunity. Thank you for the opportunity and also thank you for your amazing presentation, sir. Can you hear my voice clearly?
I can't see you. Hello?
Could you turn on your camera also, please,
Oh,
Lulu?
Lulu.
Yeah.
Oh, hello, Lulu. Yeah, now I can see you. Yes, thank you so much. It does make a difference to see somebody, doesn't it? Okay, please carry on.
Now
Yeah.
you can hear my voice clearly.
Yes, I can very clearly.
Okay. My name is Lulu. I'm from IPB University, and I will ask you about, there are many issues that say that oil palm plantation destroy forest structure as main contributor to oxygen, right? So, but I don't. Oil plantation also a plant, so it means oil plantations can contribute to oxygen and save water, right?
Right.
So, what do you
Right.
think about this?
Okay, look.
My English is not good, so.
No, I understand what you're saying. I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
Look, I am not.
So.
I hear what you're saying. What do I think about oil palm? I mean, basically, oil palm has its place. Oil palm, very, very productive. One of the most productive vegetable oil plants in the world. It is a fantastic plant. It does indeed absorb carbon. It does produce oxygen. It does provide employment in the right place. luluk in the right place, it is a fantastic commodity. However, if we cut down rainforest for it, and if we do a proper, full, total economic valuation, then the cost will be higher than the benefit. If we plant oil palm in private land, which, shall we say, hasn't had forest on it for decades and decades, or even hundreds of years, I have no issue with that. But if we plant it in a rainforest, and if we do a TEV, a total economic valuation, we will see that those benefits, which are very real, of oil palm, they're very real. 2 to 3% of Indonesia's GDP comes from oil palm. It's a fantastic crop, yeah? But not everywhere, not everywhere. In the rainforest, it's a bad deal. In the rainforest, what if you do, well, quantitatively, you can calculate this, but I can tell you that it is not as good as the rainforest, as, for example, managing water resources for those downstream. And anyway, oftentimes burning is used to clear the rainforest, which results in carbon emissions and so forth. But if you do a proper cost-benefit analysis, which looks at all the benefits of the rainforest, all the tangible benefits of the rainforest, such as managing water resources, the genetic resources and so forth, then the benefit of oil palm is less than the cost of losing the rainforest. But in other land, it's fantastic. So I've probably, by giving you that answer, managed to upset the NGOs and also upset the oil palm plantations. But then I am a provocateur pikiran. Did I answer your question? You're mute.
Lulu, could you turn on your microphone, please? Oh, Lulu. Wait a second.
Yeah, thank you for your explanation, Mr. Chris. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yes, interesting question. Yeah, for the next opportunity, I will invite Jacqueline Yosef. Jacqueline, are you with us? I already turned on your microphone.
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, please, Jacqueline.
Okay. Okay, thank you. My copy I see. What do you think about the implementations of community-based forest management in the context of landscape management and governance? Thank you.
Excuse me, Jacqueline.
Yes.
Excuse me, Jacqueline. Could you introduce
Yes.
to us from which country are you?
My name is Jacqueline Joseph, and I'm from University Malaysia Sabah.
Okay.
Malaysia.
Yeah. And what about your
Yeah,
nationality, please?
I'm Malaysian.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Perfect.
Okay, Jacqueline. I mean, basically, you've sort of asked two questions. If you mean community-based forestry with a small c, which is whereby communities, groups of individuals manage forest as they have done for decades and decades and decades, there's no doubt that that has a place and should have a place in landscape-based approaches, and is very, very good as far as emissions are concerned. It's true that sometimes it depends how we define community-based as well. Do you mean communal, whereby everybody owns, or it's groups of individuals who householders who maybe manage 2 hectares of land and they're all together in the same area? And so ultimately it results in a forest, like a rubber forest or it might be a Sharia Damar forest, or it might be a rattan forest, and so forth. I mean, there's no doubt that that's really that's very positive as far as the environmental, economic, and social side is concerned. I'm not sure about the situation in Malaysia. In Indonesia, of course, we distinguish between what I've just described and social forestry or community-based forestry, which is licensed by the Ministry of Forestry. Because community-based forestry can occur in private land as well. But the Ministry of the Environment and Forestry in Indonesia licenses, and there are 5 different kinds of license. So, and they're all quite different. There are traditional licenses. There are 2 kinds of social license. There's a woodlot license, and many of them are in degraded areas. And if they are properly selected, then they do incentivize local communities to reforest degraded lands. So far in Indonesia, we have not granted so many community-based forestry licenses to the rainforest, to where there's rainforest cover, but it's been mostly in degraded areas, and that can work well. I'm not saying, Jacqueline, it always does. I mean, there have been instances where licenses have been given to the wrong people, and that's why when you give out a license, I talked about license accountability. Giving out of the license needs to be done very carefully. It needs to be done in a transparent and open way. It needs to be accountable. It needs to be very clear what the terms of the license are. And there's been quite a revolution in such licenses, what we call perhutanan sosial, in Indonesia, a large increase now. As I speak now, over 4 million hectares has already been licensed to community forestry licenses. So they certainly have a role to play, no doubt about that. But whether, yeah, they certainly do, as a production system which is good for the environment and good for people, and therefore is compliant with what we mean with a landscape-wise or a landscape-based approach. I'm not sure if I've really given you the answer you were looking for. By all means, ask me more if I have not managed to answer your question satisfactorily.
Thank you, Prof. Chris. Because you already talked quite a lot of time, would you like to take some water, please?
No, I'm fine. Oh, wait a minute, why
Yeah.
not? Do I have any water? Yes, I do.
Yeah.
It's very kind of you, Penny. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So for the next question will be for Lestari. Lestari, are you with us?
Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Please, the time is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Penny. Good night, Professor Chris. So my question is about what step must be taken to harmonize various interests in land management, because in many cases, each stakeholders feels that they have the most rights to manage the land. So often it creates a land tenure conflict, even though land management license have been granted to certain parties. So in many cases, it also triggers land regression. Thank you.
It can be very tough. What I've described can be particularly difficult if, I mean, I was emphasizing to you what a landscape-based approach is, what it should be, but what to do in the instance you've just given me, Lestari, where, for example, supposing a license to, well, if you like, to grow oil palm you know, over 20,000 hectares was given without proper consultation. You know, that's a problem. That's a huge problem. And how to correct that? It's a fair point. What do you do when the license has already been given? What I usually do is it's very difficult, Lestari, to say, let's cancel all the licenses and start from zero. That's just not going to happen. That's not going to happen. People have invested so much money, shall we say, in an oil palm plantation, yeah, because people love to hate oil palm. What I would say to oil palm, whether it's in mineral soils or in peatland areas, unless you take into account the interests of your neighbors, there may be other plantations. There's certainly communities. You are going to have difficult relations with them. In the peatlands, you're going to risk the possibility that they might set fires, which will destroy your oil palm. And it's in your interest, to work more closely together with the local communities. Now, it's not that easy either, because the camp managers of the oil palm plantation are very distrustful of local communities. And the local communities are very distrustful of the camp managers. And so you already have a conflict setting. I mean, we found this all over the world, not just in Indonesia, everywhere. You simply need, when you're in the same landscape, in the same river basin, for example, or in the same peatscape, the same hydrological unit, kawasan hidrologis gambutnya, you simply have to have a facilitator who then sits the oil palm plantation, the local community, and local government down together to build trust and understanding amongst all parties, and to find a way to accommodate each other. Because I think that's the only way forward. It's conflict resolution, dispute resolution to begin with. It's conflict resolution if it's already got to the point where, of course, communities may be burning the equipment of the company. It's complicated, but you need facilitation, and you need also to now we're really getting into the details here of how you get better cooperation and coordination. You need to focus on what people's interests are, not what their positions are. Not, I am the boss of this, but my interest is to increase the productivity of the oil palm. Because as soon as you say, I'm the boss of the oil palm, I'm the head of the village, I'm the head of the district, you'll just attack each other. And this has been proven all over the world in conflict resolution. Get away from positions, move more to interests, and see if those interests can converge. And I have seen that they can, that we generally have similar interests, although our positions may be very, very different. It's difficult, but you do need independent facilitation. No doubt about that. I hope, I mean, that's a course in itself, is conflict resolution, and how do you make this happen in the kind of setting you've just described, Lestari. But it can be done.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Chris. For the next question will be from Zubair Azim. Zubair, are you with us?
Yes.
Okay, yes,
Thank
the
you.
time is yours. Yes, please.
Thank you so much, Professor Chris, for your presentation. My question is, I want to know.
Could you say where you're from? Where are you from?
Okay, I'm from Nigeria. I'm
Fantastic.
a student in university.
Okay,
I'm
great,
a student
great.
in Papua, Malaysia.
Okay.
So I want to know what mechanism could be used for landscape forest financing to improve an insecure landscape area.
Well, we have an increasing number of instruments. You know, the private sector is interested, as you may know, in carbon offsets, whereby they are polluters and they want to pay those who might avoid deforestation and so forth. Governments are putting more and more money into this. Donors are putting more and more money into this. In the case of Indonesia, and it may be the case in Malaysia, Nigeria, I don't know, we have fundamentally three basic mechanisms. One is, and this is already working, and it's payment for water resources, where a municipality pays the upstream landowners to keep the area under forest. And I can give you in the city of Mataram in the island of Lombok in Indonesia, pays several communities to keep their agroforestry intact. Because they recognize that without the agroforestry, they will not have enough water in the rainy season. Also, hydro installations. The state company for electricity in Lampung in southern Sumatra pays communities to keep the land vegetated with trees, so that there's enough water going into the reservoir, because the trees guarantee that. So we have payment for water resources. Increasingly, as you know, of course, there is interest on the part of not just the private sector, but international donors, notably Norway, to channel funds to those who will maintain rainforests intact, will reduce deforestation, for example. And there's a new agency in Indonesia, it's called the BPDLH, which is intended to channel these kinds of external funds. And then thirdly, the Ministry of Finance in Indonesia is now making ecological transfers to the regions for ecologically sound investments. Having said all that, Zubair, I think that the ideal all the time is, if these financial streams can add additional incentives to incentives that already exist. I'm always a bit concerned about forest management that requires a constant injection of funds from the outside. Whereas if it adds value to the forest management, then I'm a bit more optimistic about it. Because if that forest management is generating revenue itself, then that is generally going to be more robust than something that requires external funding. But we're very much exploring all these now in Indonesia, as I'm sure you are in Nigeria and in Malaysia as well. But lots of opportunities, lots of experiments. And I don't think anybody has the best solution, but I think that we're fortunate that there are many different financial instruments which are being explored as we speak.
Okay, thank you very much, Zubair, and also Bro Chris. So for the next opportunity, I would like to invite Mia Clarissa. Mia, are you with us? Mia,
Yes,
okay. Okay, yes.
yes, thank you. Thank
Yeah, the
you,
time
Miss
is
Penny.
yours. Yes. Don't forget
Okay,
to inform from which country are you.
okay. Thank you, Professor Bennett. I'm Mia Clarissa from Indonesia. So I had conducted bioecology research, in particular area in central Kalimantan named Belantikan Hulu. And this area comprises of limited production forest and currently under active logging and mining concession operated by private sector companies. And those wasn't conservation area. Meanwhile, uh, the area has been confirmed being habitat of endemic banteng Kalimantan because I researched about population of banteng Kalimantan,
Yeah.
and also the habitat of the largest population of orangutan, which has been endangered and also now critical endangered status by IUCN. So I think there is a problem in land use management, isn't it? And there is a mismatch between land use status and the real function. And my question is, how can this happen and what we can do for fixing that? Thank you.
Okay, my presentation is what we can do to fix it. Mia, yeah. How it happened, it's pretty much an open secret that in the past in Indonesia, licenses were allocated to private companies without enough consideration about the environmental impact. Even if they had an environmental impact assessment, an AMDAL, there was not enough consideration in the past about the environmental impact. And particularly, you mentioned mines and forestry. Almost certainly when, I don't know which was given first, but it's a different ministry or a different agency which gives the license. And oftentimes, unless they adopt a landscape approach, and I doubt that they do, or they did in the past anyway, is that they wouldn't consider the impact on their neighbor. So I could imagine where the forestry company and the mining company ultimately would interfere with each other's water resources, and neither would sufficiently take into account all the flora and fauna which they should be concerned with. Now, I'm not familiar with benteng particularly, but take orangutan. I've worked a lot with orangutan. Orangutan is a keystone species. People think orangutans are just nice and furry. They're not just that. If you get rid of the orangutans, you will change the nature, the structure of the forest, because orangutans disseminate many of the important trees which make up the architecture of the forest. Again, a landscape-based approach will take all these things into account. Now, we are where we are. There was once a famous minister of the environment in England, Claire Short, and no, Ministry for Overseas Development. And she resigned when Blair joined with Mr. Bush to invade Iraq. But she had a wonderful saying, which I have always hung on to. We are where we are. What do we do about it? You know, we can't start from zero again. So again, in your particular area, Mia, I would suggest, and there are many tools out there. I mean, I've just been outlining everything, yeah. I would see whether you couldn't apply the landscape-based approach principles to the wilaya, to the area of interest where you are, to show the miners, to show the loggers that really it's in their interest not to behave sebagai pulau, not to behave as an island, but to bear in mind that the wider environment affects them too, and will in fact affect them increasingly over time. So yeah, I mean, applying landscape-based approaches can be in everybody's interest. And it's not it's not something, Mia, you achieve in one meeting. It's not like a socializasi where you just say, hey, this is the way it is, right? No, you've just got to keep at it time and time again. I would suggest to you that think about how the mine and the logging company might adversely affect each other. And also, is your fauna, the benteng, is it a keystone species? Does it affect the ecosystem?
Yeah.
Does it?
Yeah.
Yes,
Well,
the
anyway,
the Banten Kalimantan is the case species. The case species in that area.
It is. Okay. The thing is that
Yes, it is.
all sorts of things can happen. I mean, this is where I'm a great believer that we've got to get, it's very difficult to do, ecologists and economists, businessmen and villagers to sit down together to talk about these things, to talk about the connectivity, the connections. I mean, landscape-based approaches are all about connections between me and you, between my kebun, my land and your land, and so on and so forth. And in your particular area, I'm sure that even you will know what those connections are. But if you introduce a landscape-based approach, you might say, let's sit down and figure out whether we think either of us are affecting our neighbor, our tatanga. It's what I call in English neighborization, tatanganizasi. Try to heighten the awareness of neighbors, be they mines and logging companies, of each other's presence and of the ecosystem in which they inhabit. You might surprise them, Mia. You might surprise them. It's a long process, and it's not an easy thing to do. But that's the best I can say now. And there are many tools and ways around there. But I'm very much an incrementalist, step by step. You're not going to achieve anything overnight. It won't be through a socializasi. It will be step by step, showing them that they have neighbors, and those neighbors need to take into account the other neighbors as well. It's very difficult. I don't deny it's difficult. I wish you good luck. I wish I could help you.
Okay, thank you for the clear suggestion, Professor Bennett. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Chris, and also all participants. I know there are still a lot of questions from all of you, but unfortunately, we are reaching the end of this session. The time is up. So before we stop this session, Prof. Chris, could you kindly close the presentation slides so we can take a picture together?
Oh, right. How do I do that? Now you're asking me to do something. Just a minute.
Just stop the share screen.
Give me I'm a little bit kaku. Just a minute.
Oh, okay.
Just
okay.
can you do it for me?
Wait a second. I think it's already okay now.
It's okay now. Okay.
Now our time to take a picture together. Mas Arif, could you help me? Just say 1, 2, 3, and then for several times, and then we can finish, right? So prepare, everyone. Mas Arif, could you turn on your mic, please? So we can indicate whether you already start or no. Mas Arif, sorry, your mic is still off. Yes. Mas Arif, please. So we have 160 participants.
2, 3.
Say cheese.
Is okay.
Next.
Next. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Next. Next. Hmm? 1, 2, 3. Next. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mas Arif. So, Prof. Chris, again, thank you very much for the lecture. We really enjoy every minute of your lecture as well as your share experience. Thank you for speaking this on this session. We are grateful for the time and effort you took to share your thought and experience with the summer course participants. Thank you also for all participants. Don't forget to fill out the online attendance form. So thank you very much. We will have the next session, which will be start on 1:30. Okay. So good afternoon and good night for Progress and have a nice weekend. Bye
Thank you
bye.
so
Thank you
much.
very much.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Salam buat